This is Land of Havilah, 2 Samuel 18. Absalom proclaimed himself king and forced David out of Jerusalem. Now Absalom has gathered the army of all Israel and brought them across the Jordan to encamp against David. David and his loyal forces are holed up in the fortified city of Mahanaim. Absalom's plan is to lay siege and eventually pull down every stone of the wall into the river, 2 Samuel 17:13, if that's what it takes to kill David. But David's not going to wait on a siege. He's ordering his troops to exit the city and attack as we go to verse 1. David counted the people who were with him and set captains of thousands and captains of hundreds over them. David sent the people out, a third part under the hand of Joab and a third part under the hand of Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, and a third part under the hand of Ittai the Gittite. Comment: Joab and Abishai are David's nephews and commanders that have been with him since the beginning, and Ittai the Gittite is the commander of the battalion of 600 Philistines that left Jerusalem with David. Verse 3. The king said to the people, I will also surely go out with you myself. But the people said, You shall not go out, for if we flee away, they will not care for us, neither if half of us die will they care for us. But you are worth 10,000 of us. Now therefore it is better that you are ready to help us out of the city. Comment: David's men are telling him, Don't go out with us. Stay in the city. We're expendable, but you're worth 10,000 of us. If Absalom's men defeat us or kill us, they still won't be able to claim victory unless they kill you. So stay here and keep yourself safe. Verse 4. The king said to them, I will do what seems best to you. The king stood beside the gate, and all the people went out by hundreds and by thousands. The king commanded Joab and Abishai and Ittai, saying, Deal gently for my sake with the young man, even with Absalom. Comment: Absalom's the man behind this entire disaster, but David has a soft spot for him because he's his son. This is a picture of God's soft spot for us. Like Absalom, we can be evil to the core, but God still has that soft spot. But the one thing God can't allow us to do is to usurp his throne. David's been extremely tolerant of Absalom, like God's tolerant of us, but that tolerance has to have a limit. If we would be king ourselves, it won't end well, no matter how much God loves us. Still in verse 5. All the people heard when the king commanded all the captains concerning Absalom. So the people went out into the field against Israel, and the battle was in the forest of Ephraim. The people of Israel were struck there before David's servants, and there was a great slaughter there that day of 20,000 men, for the battle was there spread over the surface of all the country, and the forest devoured more people that day than the sword devoured. Comment: The battle was over the surface of all the country, which is apparent because at least some of it spread to the forest of Ephraim, which is in the highlands on the opposite side of the Jordan River, perhaps 25 or 30 miles from Mahanaim. David's much smaller force defeated Absalom's army of all Israel, with 20,000 killed. It says the forest devoured more than the sword, which is hard to interpret, but perhaps it means that fighting in the forest was unconventional, with more than the usual amount of terror, because contact with the enemy could occur unexpectedly at any given moment. And it was more difficult to keep a large force organized in the forest than it was to keep a small force organized, so this neutralized the advantage of Absalom's larger army. David and his men are wily and experienced tacticians. That's why probably the battle was in the forest, and God is with them to destroy Absalom, 2 Samuel 17:14. Speaking of unexpected contact with the enemy in the forest, verse 9, Absalom happened to meet David's servants. Absalom was riding on his mule, and the mule went under the thick boughs of a great oak, and his head caught hold of the oak, and he was taken up between the sky and the earth, and the mule that was under him went on. Comment: Absalom's alive, stuck between some thick, close-set branches in the oak, hanging in mid-air. Verse 10. A certain man saw it and told Joab and said, Behold, I saw Absalom hanging in an oak. Comment: A certain man saw what happened, left the scene, and reported it to Joab. Joab has a ruthless history. He murdered Abner after David had sent him away in peace, 2 Samuel 3:27. So, if Joab does something to Absalom, it won't be the first time he defied David. Verse 11. Joab said to the man who told him, "Behold, you saw it, and why didn't you strike him there to the ground? I would have given you 10 pieces of silver and a sash." Comment: the sash or belt would have served the same purpose as a military medal in our day, to draw attention to a great deed on the battlefield. Verse 12. The man said to Joab, "Though I should receive 1,000 pieces of silver in my hand, I still wouldn't stretch out my hand against the king's son. For in our hearing the king commanded you, and Abishai and Ittai, saying, Beware that no one touch the young man Absalom. Otherwise, if I had dealt falsely against his life, and there is no matter hidden from the king, then you yourself would have set yourself against me." Comment: the certain man says, "That's a bunch of baloney. If I'd killed Absalom, the king would have found out, and instead of talking about rewarding me, you would have kept silent while I faced what was coming to me." Verse 14. Then Joab said, "I'm not going to wait like this with you." He took 3 darts in his hand. Comment: darts could be translated spears or any kind of rod-shaped objects, still in verse 14, and thrust them through the heart of Absalom while he was yet alive in the middle of the oak. 10 young men who bore Joab's armor surrounded and struck Absalom and killed him. Comment: this reminds us of that other person in the Bible who was stuck on a tree and had a spear run into his side. But however much this situation reminds us of the crucifixion, we could hardly call Absalom a Christ-like figure. Perhaps he was a Christ-like figure, though, in a limited sense, in the sense that he was cursed to be there, as Christ bore the curse for us. Galatians 3:13, quote, "Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law, having become a curse for us. For it is written, Cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree." End quote. Now that Absalom's dead, there's no more reason to fight. Verse 16. Joab blew the trumpet, and the people returned from pursuing after Israel, for Joab held the people back. Comment: this sounding of the trumpet actually originated with Yahweh in the law of Moses, Numbers 10, 1 through 10. Yahweh commanded that there should be particular soundings to communicate particular messages. Here Joab sounded the message for withdrawal. Verse 17. They took Absalom and cast him into the great pit in the forest. Comment: it's a clumsy translation to say into the great pit. Most translations say into a great pit. Still in verse 17. And raised over him a very great heap of stones. Then all Israel fled, each to his own tent. Comment: all Israel fled, meaning Absalom's forces fled after they found out Absalom was dead. Verse 18. Now Absalom in his lifetime had taken and reared up for himself the pillar which is in the king's valley. For he said, I have no son to keep my name in memory. He called the pillar after his own name. It's called Absalom's monument to this day. Comment: the king's valley is an obscure location somewhere adjacent to Jerusalem. Absalom put a monument to himself there. Absalom had no sons when he built the monument, but 4 chapters ago, 3 sons were born to Absalom, 2 Samuel 14:27. We can resolve this by assuming he didn't have the sons at the time he set up the monument. Either they were born after he put up the monument, or they died before he put it up. But because the mention comes here that he had no sons, he probably lost them before he put up the monument and died with no sons. This is supported because the text doesn't mention any sons from here on. All that to say, it's pretty clear he died with no sons, which becomes important in a moment. Now coming up, Ahimaaz, the young priest loyal to David, is on the battlefield. He's asking Joab permission to run and bring news of the victory to David. Verse 19. Then Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said, Let me run now and carry the king news how Yahweh has avenged him of his enemies. Joab said to him, You must not be the bearer of news today, but you must carry news another day. But today you must carry no news, because the king's son is dead. Then Joab said to the Cushite, Go, tell the king what you have seen. The Cushite bowed himself to Joab and ran. Then Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said yet again to Joab, But come what may, please let me also run after the Cushite. Joab said, Why do you want to run, my son, since that you have no reward for the news? But come what may, he said, I will run. He said to him, Run. Then Ahimaaz ran by the way of the plain and outran the Cushite. Comment: Ahimaaz is one of the young priests loyal to David. He wanted to carry the news of victory, but Joab said, Don't do it, because you'll also have to carry the news that Absalom's dead. So Joab sent a Cushite instead. But Ahimaaz finally got permission from Joab himself because he said, "Come what may, I will run." And he outran the Cushite. So Joab's well aware that David will not be happy about Absalom being dead, and so is Ahimaaz. Verse 24. Now David was sitting between the two gates, and the watchman went up to the roof of the gate to the wall, and lifted up his eyes, and looked, and behold, a man running alone. The watchman cried and told the king. The king said, "If he is alone, there is news in his mouth." He came closer and closer. The watchman saw another man running, and the watchman called to the gatekeeper and said, "Behold, a man running alone." The king said, "He also brings news." The watchman said, "I think the running of the first one is like the running of Ahimaaz the son of Zadok." The king said, "He is a good man and comes with good news." Comment. Now Ahimaaz is arriving in the gate with the news, and the Cushite is soon to follow. Ahimaaz is out of breath, and verse 28. Ahimaaz called and said to the king, "All is well." He bowed himself before the king with his face to the earth and said, "Blessed is Yahweh your God, who has delivered up the men who lifted up their hand against my lord the king." The king said, "Is it well with the young man Absalom?" Ahimaaz answered, "When Joab sent the king's servant, even me your servant, I saw a great tumult, but I don't know what it was." The king said, "Come and stand here." He came and stood still. Comment. Ahimaaz knew the good news and the bad news, but he only told the good. Then David asked him point blank about Absalom. Ahimaaz knew the answer, but he kept it back. Before Ahimaaz started the run, he said he was going to tell the news come what may, so it's interesting that he chose not to tell the bad news. David told him to stand aside so he can hear from the Cushite. There's no mention of David celebrating the victory. It seems he only wants to know about Absalom. Verse 31. Behold, the Cushite came. The Cushite said, "News for my lord the king, for Yahweh has avenged you today of all those who rose up against you." The king said to the Cushite, "Is it well with the young man Absalom?" The Cushite answered, "May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you to do you harm be as that young man is." Comment. The Cushite gave the good news and the bad news. Verse 33. The king was much moved and went up to the room over the gate and wept. As he went, he said, my son Absalom, I wish I had died for you. Absalom, my son, my son." Comment. David is devastated. Victory didn't matter. He just wanted his son to be saved. He went up. Notice that he went up to the room over the gate. There was an inner gate and an outer gate, and above that area there was a room. He went up there and wept as God in heaven would weep. That was a long story recorded in detail, but why? What's the point of God including this in the Bible? There's at least one clear point here that's very much worth 1,000 chapters. Christ won the victory, but it won't matter to God unless you and I are saved. That's all he wants to hear about. And if we're not, he's going to be overwhelmed with sorrow. Not that anything could overwhelm God, but if anything could, that would be the closest. To make it even simpler, God loves us. Want to hear him say it? Jeremiah 31:3, quote, "I have loved you with an everlasting love," end quote. Absalom died a cursed death, hanging on a tree with no sons. So let's not leave Christ with no sons. We've been reading one ugly chapter after another about Absalom, asking ourselves, what's the point? And we finally come to it. God doesn't want to lose his sons. We're the king's sons. We have everything we want. He loves us. He gives us tremendous latitude and refuses to see our faults. We're due to inherit the kingdom anyway. How wicked and pointlessly tragic would it be to rebel against him? 2 Samuel 19 is next at landofhavilah.net, 2 Samuel 19. This is the map of 2 Samuel 18. David stayed in Mahanaim, about here, while the armies fought over the surface of all the country, including the forest of Ephraim in this area. 2 Samuel 19 is next.